can say our mutual prayer. This prayer, of course, I should point out, is for students and teachers so that they may coordinate their efforts, they may get strength, and they may work together well, because communication, all these teachings, takes two things. It requires me to convey what is contained in these Upanishads. And that's very difficult because the Upanishads are cursory statements, if you will, or thoughts, teachings laid down to be commentated on, expanded on, to be heard, to be reflected on, and to be meditated on. And these Upanishads, you'd be mistaken if you think it's all academic, but two things are necessary for our understanding. The first thing that is necessary is to elucidate what are the principles. And once we understand the principles, applying rationale, not applying dogmatic statements. Everything in the Upanishads must be reasonable and reasoned well. And that part of it is called manana, reflecting on what you have heard. And not necessarily accepting it, but reflecting on it and seeing, firstly, is it rational? Secondly, is it meaningful? And then finding out does it actually mean? What is the depth of it? What is the deeper aspect of it? The experiential aspect of it. And that we only get through our direct experience. So we haven't met here now, studying this Katha Upanishad for the last several weeks. And so we now need to take this subject up. And if you remember from last time, we were talking about an analogy. And the analogy is a familiar analogy. It's a familiar example. It's to be found everywhere. Before we get into that, there's now, repeat the peace prayer that is ahead of this. And so it is, by now you're familiar with it. So together you can repeat it with me. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditam Astuma Vittishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May that one protect us both. May that one preserve and nourish us both. May we have tremendous vigor in our work together. May we gain strength, not weakness. And may our study make us or draw us nearer to illumination. May we not unnecessarily cavil or disagree with each other. And peace, peace, peace be unto all. So picking up the theme of the chariot, it struck me that we find a resonance in the subject matter with some of Plato's works. Now, Plato was an idealist. That means he had this philosophy that said that there were idealistic forms somewhere. And that came into the early Christian philosophy until it was replaced or displaced, we might say, by Aristotle and Aristotelian thinking. But still, even though we may take these philosophies and analyze and so on from the intellectual point of view, the heart of it must be the same if it's to be true. And Plato gives a wonderful, wonderful statement, and he puts it, and of course, he puts this intellect that we are talking about as nous. Now, this is not the human intellect. Nous is the cosmic mind, the cosmic intellect from which everything comes. And so when Plato's philosophy is idealistic, he's actually talking from the cosmic point of view. And this is equivalent to what in Sanskrit is called buddhi or vijnana. That is, there's a cosmic mind somewhere. Some cosmic balancing power is there. All right, good. And that, what has that to do with practical life? What has that to do with dealing with our day-to-day problems? Well, first it's necessary to find out where these problems come from. And so he puts this nous, the ruling power of the soul. But then when we use the English language soul, spirit, mind, we can easily get confused with all these terms. So I think it's a good idea to see what these terms mean in reality and what the possible confusion would be in using these terms. The ruling power of the soul, but it is an integrator of all the different elements, says Plato. And what are these different elements? Reason, emotion, and sensual appetites. All of these we find in this analogy of the chariot and charioteer. And then I'm going to refer to a different Upanishad here. This is the Upanishad. And just to familiarize those who are not fully familiar with the Upanishads, there are said to be over 108 Upanishads. But some of these are not really significant. Some of these are sectarian. So the real Upanishads are those that are so ancient and so profound that the schools of different thoughts have deemed it necessary to write commentaries on these. Now, we have been following the first volume of 8 Upanishads by Swami Purnananda because it incorporates the commentary by Adi Shankaracharya. That is, we're taking a dualistic point of view, or at least a non-dualistic point of view, I should say. But equally, there are the commentaries from Maitri, the commentaries from, or sorry, not Maitri, from Ramanuja, and we are integrating these. We are seeing things through different points of view. Why should that be necessary? Because to jump to a non-dualistic conclusion will be extremely difficult. That is why we have to use analogies. We have to use figures of speech. We have to bring things down to the human level so that progressively we can discover the lofty heights, the lofty conclusions of the Upanishads, which fit within the realm of this Advaita, this non-dualistic philosophy. It is not just a point of view. If it were just a view, we would take this whole subject matter and put it at the university level. So there was a questioner, somebody who is contacting us quite frequently, and asked this, how can I get out of dualism, is a question was asked. Then I gave the answer. The person said, oh, that's very complicated. I think I need a doctorate to understand this. But you see, it's not that. It's not at that level. These profound ideas are unfamiliar to us because it is the exact opposite of what our gut tells us. Our day-to-day life, our sense life, is what we're familiar with. How can we get from that day-to-day experience to the profound experience where there's only pure being, pure consciousness, pure existence, pure bliss? First of all, we have to be patient. Being impatient, saying, I want to jump there straight away, it won't work for most people. The jnani yogis who have tried this are people of keen intellect and profound understanding, dedicated life, dedicating their whole activities to this pursuit. But for the vast majority of humanity, caught up in a working, waking world, and we have to deal with all the difficulties that arise. But that tells us one important thing. We are responding automatically to the objects of our senses. And we are not integrating this necessarily, as Plato would have us do, with all the other components, such as emotion and reasoning. These all have to tally well. And by doing this, what he's done is he's located three aspects of the thinking, feeling, willing mind, the volitional aspect. This volitional aspect, this emotional aspect, this reactive aspect, will only be one aspect of what is there in the psyche. And then there's a further integrator, not mentioned by Plato, and that is meditation. Meditation is that capacity of the mind to integrate and harmonize all these elements nicely, so that all these disturbing waves in the mind become clarified. This is a progressive effort, and we have to start somewhere. Where do we start? Where we start, where you stand now. Where you stand now is where you start. How can I be spiritual in the midst of all these day-to-day activities? No, it's the very day-to-day activities which are your toolbox. It is using what you have around you. I've learned very nicely over the years that if I want to make something useful, don't discard the old things. Have something useful. There was some cooking program that put a renowned chef in the midst of unfamiliar territory. And I think it was Cambodia, a remote tribe in the forest in Cambodia. And then he describes going to the supermarket. But the supermarket is not what you think it is. The supermarket is the forest itself. You have to use what you have. You can't look for foreign ingredients. You can't go to an actual urban supermarket and say, oh, everything is supplied here. Nowadays, if you go to a supermarket, everything is supplied there. You'll find things which are not indigenous to your own country. In Ireland, we don't get oranges growing on trees. The climate doesn't warrant it. We don't grow grapes. The climate doesn't warrant it. And yet, if you look at the diet of the average person here in Ireland, all of these ingredients are brought in. And so that is good. The world has become a vast, vast marketplace, sometimes for our good and sometimes to our detriment. Sometimes useful for our health, for our broader diet, but sometimes destructive to the planet. That's not the subject of our discourse today anyway, on the Katha Upanishad. But we're going to come back to this beautiful, beautiful parable, this beautiful example. And then the Upanishad doesn't stop there. It tells us that the key aspect of this example, that is, taking the example of a chariot. Now we have to be old-fashioned about it. We have to imagine the old-style chariot. Comparing it to a car, that can work a little bit. So we can use both analogies. But you see, the aspect of a chariot, the parable there, is quite useful because, antiquated as it may seem, you can have all these horses pulling off in different directions. You won't get the benefit of the example we're using the analogy of a motor car, because a motor car, everything is nicely assembled. But imagine now the horses that see all the objects and want to rush toward it. Now, if this is not fully controlled, it is not good for the chariot and the chariot driver and all the rest of it, but it is not good for others either. Because 5 horses, let's say, that's restricted to 5 in the first place, will want to follow 5 different roads, 5 different paths. And that creates mayhem for all the other users. I often think with a sense of fun and amusement, what it was like when the first cars came out. You know, an antiquated thing, and many people's commentary was, it'll never replace the horse, because the horse would go much faster. And the capacity of the car was more like engaging in a kind of hobby. But then when these cars became faster, it was necessary to have traffic regulation. Otherwise, all these cars were going all over the world, just as horses might do. There was no left or right. And so some kind of regulation, even regulation about speed, that the car could only safely go with a person in front, with a lamp or something. And that means all cars were going at walking pace. It was soon discovered that the horsepower, that is the analogy of the horse in energetic terms applied to a car, that had to be used and accommodation had to be made. We're living in a changing world where we have to accommodate things. But by accommodating things, it doesn't mean lack or loss of control. Accommodation does not mean mayhem. Accommodation doesn't mean being loose and fancy-free. Accommodation simply means let us use the inherent flexibility of the mind, what today in psychology is called neuroplasticity. The idea of neuroplasticity arises from an example of cab drivers in London. An experiment was conducted where cab drivers were given brand new routes to learn. They knew the old familiar routes. Now they had to learn new ones. And then they analyzed what was happening neurologically. And it was discovered new channels were being made in the brain. Now, this is word for word, new channels made in the brain, Swami Vivekananda's commentary contained in Patanjali Yoga Sutras. It is difficult to make new channels in the brain. It is difficult to change a channel. It is difficult to change things or embrace change. Everybody likes the old familiar routes. But somehow, if we are to get out of our difficulties, the practical thing to do is to change our outlook, to change our routes. And mostly people allow the mind just to go off by itself. And the mind is the queen bee of all the senses. Where the mind goes, all the sense organs go. And where will they follow? They'll follow habitual pathways and will find a sense of disorganization disguised as order. It's no wonder that a life then becomes chaotic. We are following chaotic ways, chaotic paths, and not getting any steady satisfaction. Meditation is a way of restoring that balance and equilibrium without destroying the emotional content of the mind, and without destroying the rational content of the mind, and without destroying the direction of the senses. The only difference is that sense appetites are not being engaged anymore, that they're being controlled. If you don't control a child's diet, a child will make their diet ice cream and chocolate, but we know that that's not good for them. So we realize this element of discipline and control found in our regularity in our social life anyway is imposed on us. If we didn't have law, then everybody would rob the banks. If we didn't have some kind of system, even in the traffic, speed limits, sides of the road, left or right, we'll argue which is correct with an American, if you like, or a European. So there has to be some regulation involved in this. We understand this. We understand this when our social transformation takes place. When we go to school, it's all about rules and regulations. Even the freest, most creative schools, such as Rudolf Steiner, or such as the nursery, kindergarten aspect, of Montessori and so on. There are certain boundaries which are there. And if we don't give children those boundaries, then the child will be indisciplined, out of control, and to create social difficulties for the child. So some boundaries are necessary. But these are all short-term things. What is the longer-term recipe for happiness? There's a beautiful passage contained, a very profound psychological passage contained in the Bhagavad Gita. Jayato vishayan pumsaha sangasteshu pajayati sangat samjayati kamaha kamat krodho vijayati. And it goes on. Krodhat bhavati samo maha samohat smrti vapramaha smrti brahmasad budhinaso budhinashat pranashati. It starts off with to vishayan. Where do we get our problems from? We allow the sense organs to dwell on the sense objects. Sense objects, whatever we hear, whatever we see, touch, taste, and so on, primarily five, but these are meaningless without the mind. It's another way of saying mind, in effect. And so, from a Sankhya and Yoga point of view, from their philosophical point of view, the sense organs are actually a component of the overall internal instrument that we call mind, something like the engine of a car. And this mind is termed exactly that, manasa. And the indriyas would be the sense organs moving toward the objects. And the reason why there are sense organs in the first place is so that they can relate to the objects. No point in having objects unless you have a way of tasting them. And so to some extent, the objects are for the good of the senses or for the benefit of the senses. It's so that the senses can move toward them. We shouldn't say, when will this sense world end? No, you don't want it to end, because you can make the senses move usefully on useful roads, here designated objects. So we're coming back to the parable then of the chariot. It's not that we give up driving the chariot, but we're now directing them along roads which are not chaotic, roads which are useful. And so the Bhagavad Gita is telling us that if we brood on the sense objects, what will happen? We'll develop attachment to them. Attachment, a kind of addiction. We see this in extreme mode when we talk about addictions. In Ireland, as in many other countries, there is really a history of addiction to alcohol. It goes back, basically, I'm told, to the Celtic times, where three structures are there. And the bards are there to tell the stories. The bards are there to bring people to a social condition where the mind can be usefully entertained, artistically, creatively entertained. And there were particular places where this took place. And this has now become the pub culture. It's not just drinking, no, it's storytelling. It's assembling around the fire. When I first came to Ireland, I was introduced to a pub called Man o' War, because it was said that this is part of Irish culture. And when I went there, I saw that it was all centered around the hearth, the fire, and there were musicians there, gathered around there, playing Irish music. It was my first taste of Irish music. And how wonderful it was, how spontaneous it was. And anybody who brought a musical instrument could join in, and anybody who had a good singing voice could join in. It was an entirely social event. What a wonderful thing. It wasn't just about, alcohol and so on. But in this country, it is developed in some way like that it has become a kind of a comfort zone for people, which develops into over-drinking. And so there is certainly the most dangerous drug in Ireland, I personally would rate as alcohol. So what happened? Brooding on the objects created attachment, an attachment to something that seemed to give us some kind of satisfaction. And then from attachment comes desire, means I have to repeat it. This hollow is still felt in me. It doesn't seem satisfactory. I have to fill it from the outside by engaging the sense organs more and more and more. And then I can't be satisfied all the time. And so what does it result in? Anger, frustration, a feeling of unfulfillment. This term krodha covers all of these subjects, a range from mild dissatisfaction, mild irritation and impatience, to out and out outburst anger. And when we see the out of control state that occurs by this addictions or attachments, no matter how strong or mild, then we'll see this anger come out. But it is based on a misunderstanding. It is based on a mix to say that I am the chariot. I am the physical entity. I am the body-mind complex. This identification is where it all starts to go wrong. Separation, what we call viveka, this discernment, discrimination, having the capacity to choose what is correct, what is right, how will we maintain control. And in the parable of the chariot, this is seen to be the chariot driver that's holding the reins and knows where to direct the horses, here or there. And this comprises restraint and letting go whenever is necessary. It requires the capacity to steer the reins, pull the reins in one direction more than the other to enable a right turn, or the other way to enable a left turn. And so it goes on. And to know also which is the pathway, which is the road that is convenient and that will be compatible with all the other traffic on the road. And inside the chariot will be the enjoyer of it, the one that sits there. It doesn't move, but the whole chariot is for this enjoyment. The real enjoyment is that. But where does this enjoy come from? It comes from this seeming association with these limiting agents. It is already free and full and perfect. But the difficulty is our language. The difficulty is how can we relate these subtle concepts and experiences in terms of human language and concepts. Naturally, some inadequacy will arise. And so in the commentaries, we will see some objections arising and answered. That if we literally say, for example, there's a realization of this internal entity, then it makes it a kind of object. And the response is, well, these are convenience terms that we are obliged to use, because how will we configure it in human language? And so where do we go from anger? Bhagavad Gita tells us from anger comes delusion. And from delusion, confused memory. And from loss of memory, memory of who we are, memory of what is the right thing to do. And from confused memory, the ruin of the key factor that's supposed to hold everything together, discrimination, the one that is holding the reins, the one that is supposed to be in control. And then, of course, from loss of discrimination, we can go down and down and down. We can perish. And those who've been on the advanced course of the NM, for example, will see levels of regression compatible with the rating, the DSM or DMS, can't remember which one it is, the kind of ranking, a recognition of steps of degeneration, psychological degenerations. Now, what is the opposite of that? The opposite of that is the other way around. Applying discrimination, we then take control of everything, and we now become useful directors of our own chariot. How do we do this? Is a threefold thing. We can describe it as knowledge, austerity, and meditation. And I started off by referring to the Maitri Upanishad. I was also mentioning that 8 Upanishads are there as principal Upanishads. In these 2 volumes, we are working from volume 1, which contains these various Upanishads. Volume 2 contains 4 other Upanishads. But 2 others should be added. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is there, and the Chandogya Upanishad, comprising 10. And then there are others that have been referred to, including Maitri Upanishad, Shubala Upanishad, Shvetashvatara Upanishad, and others like this. But we can say there are 12, these 12, or even if we say 10 worth studying. And from these 10, apart from all these useful cross-references, this will give us a good understanding of the teachings and principles and practices contained in these key texts, from which everything else is going to be derived. There's a useful passage in the Maitri Upanishad. It starts off like this: Ashti Brahmate Brahma Vidyavid Brahmavid, or Brahma, I should say. Brahman is said, Brahman is. That's a statement by one who knows the knowledge of Brahman. It's not just the objective knowledge, but knows it in reality. Is it enough? Knowing about Brahman and getting close in terms of knowledge, still with Brahman seemingly as an object, understanding that Brahman is what? Brahman is pure being. There's no object that comes with it. One who knows this knowledge is a door. And that person declares it, who had freed himself from evil or from ignorance, we can say, by the practice of austerity, has a different statement to say. He says, Om, that is the manifest version of that. We start off with Brahman is, and then we come to Om, equivalent to this cosmic mind, what we may say as Mahat, what we say as Buddhi, what Plato calls Nous. From that point of view, they will find the greatness of Brahman. This is said, a statement like this would be said from one who's completely absorbed and always meditates on this aspect. And so by knowledge and by austerity, but also by meditation, is Brahman apprehended. And he who becomes one, who goes beyond this nous, this cosmic mind, that is also called Brahma. We have to make a distinction between this term and Brahman is the ultimate principle. And we can get close to an understanding of it by using different terms. We'll come to that shortly. But then that's the highest version of Brahman. But there's a lower, expressive, creative aspect of it. And that we can call this Brahma. Now, these are all interchangeable terms for us to kind of understand more and more what does it mean. So Nous is there, Logos is there, Buddhi is there, Mahat is there. These are all interchangeable terms to increase and assist our understanding. One more term is used, Hiranya Garbha. Garbha means a womb. A womb in human understanding is where children come from, beings come from. It is as a result of procreation that this womb then creates, as it were. From this comes everything. Let us look at, does the cosmos work on the same basis? Yes. On what basis? There's a garbha, there's a womb. What is its description? It is hiranya, that it is golden. It is something that has light within it, something that is intelligence, something that is ultimately the most valuable of all. It is a cosmic mind. And to the state of the Supreme Divinity above all the other effulgent entities. He obtains happiness, undecaying, unmeasured, free from sickness. He who knows this and worships this supreme principle, Brahman, with this knowledge, austerity, meditation. This is the how of it. This is the yoga. We have to understand the principle of it. We have to get close to understanding it. We have to embark on a path of austerity. That is, changing our habits. That's all. And changing is not acceptable easily by us. So it involves a little friction. And meditation. This is the way. This is commensurate really with discrimination. This is commensurate with worship. This is commensurate or love of God. And this is commensurate with meditation. And in this, all our activities can be controlled, can be done mindfully, can be done with increased value. This is the practical way. Then freed from those things by which he was filled and affected. This rider of the chariot, again, Maitri Upanishad is echoing some familiar ideas. Now telling us about a chariot. Ratitas cha te veva muktas Atman eva sayojam upiti. He obtains this happiness. How? He is freed from those things which he was filled and affected by. This rider of the chariot attains, as it were, we have to say as it were, complete union with the self, realizes it. Then the question comes, well, is it separate? Was it ever separate? The answer is no. It's just our convenience language, because the framework for it is this parable, this chariot. I can drive a car. Am I the car? No, I'm not the car. Can I enjoy the journey? I can enjoy the journey. So what is the entity driving, holding the wheel? We can say it is the charioteer. It is your intellect. It is the discernment. Is there a cosmic variety of it? Yes, there is. But it is always free. That's the difference. And this chariot driver, this steering wheel, this engine, the wheels, the roads even are called upadis, limiting adjuncts, because they seem to limit the full expressive glory of that which is always free. But on the other side, they're manifesting the glory. This is something that should be understood. It's the other side of the coin, is manifesting as well. It is like the sun, and a cloud comes in front, and we see at that beautiful moment the radiating rays that come, giving a golden tinge to the cloud, and we can see the rays of the sun, indicating the sun itself. What is in the way? We can't see the sun, the cloud is in the way. It is a limiting adjunct. But is it also not a manifesting adept? Can we not see the rays and the glorious distribution, the permeating aspect of this? Should we not be able to see both? Should we do away with this world completely? Not at all. Should we enjoy it? Yes. Should we be bound by it? And if we are bound to enjoy it, if we should enjoy it, then why is it that we don't? Why is it that we don't catch this full glory everywhere? Why is it that we say, what a pity? Why don't we say, what a glory? Manifest everywhere. All right. So this is a useful co-passage contained in the Maitri Upanishad. Let us now pick up this example when we are talking of the first chapter, third section, and now the third stanza of it. This gives us, we've gone through this before, but it's necessary when we haven't met for a while, just to relink this, to catch up with this. The great mystic Rumi has said this. He said, the heart has pulled the reins of the five senses. The heart has pulled the reins of the five senses. Everybody who embarks on this inquiry, this mystic inquiry, this real journey inward, not just outward, but the real journey inward, with this goal of controlling nature, as Swami Vivekananda says, both external and internal, not just internal, but the external world as well. Our spiritual experience, our spiritual journey has its effect on the outside world, because the objects are exactly the same as the senses that catch it. And the senses that catch it, they are part and parcel of the mind. The whole thing works together as a total machine moving forward. And so what is the method? The method is that I've described is yoga. But what is yoga? We have to understand that yoga is derived from a root, yaj. Two roots are there, but one is yaj, which means to yoke, to harness. That is where this analogy is so beautiful and so complete, because it tells us the method as well. We have to harness the mind and harness the senses and direct it in a better way, a more useful way. Should we be anxious? When will it happen? Why aren't we there yet? Not at all. It takes a long time to train horses. It takes a long time to train the mind. But the more we attend to it, the quicker it becomes. What is concentration? Concentration is that aspect where we shorten the time of doing something to the point where time itself is lost. We have lost all sense of time as a result of it. So, to harness, this complete harnessing is harnessing of nature, external and internal, says Swami Vivekananda. You remember? Derived also from his Raja Yoga. Each soul is potentially divine. The goal is to manifest this from within. Controlling nature, external and internal, both. External, the physical world, the gross world, wherein the objects and senses interact. And the internal world, that more subtle area, the world of the mind, the driving force, the engine, if you will. Again, Plato's Republic will tell us, the just man sets in order his own inner life, and in his own master, and at peace with himself. And when he has bound together the three principles within him, reason, emotion, and the sensual appetites, and is no longer many, but has become one entirely temperate and perfectly adjusted nature, then he will proceed to act. If he has act, whether in state affairs or in private business of his own, giving a practical dimension to this to say that affecting this chariot, this psychophysical entity, seeming individual entity, we now affect everything, not only on an interactive way, but our whole view of life now becomes one of blessing, one of stability, one that is used for the welfare of all beings, and not confusion, not banging into people, causing a traffic jam. So you can see how appropriate this analogy has become. All right, let us take this analogy up now. So we can skip a few passages because we covered them last time, but let us see what is the importance and significance of them. So going back to the parable, know the individual self as the master of the chariot and the body as the chariot. That's quite clear. Know the intellect as the charioteer and the mind as truly the bridle. That is, that connecting volitional aspect, reactive aspect of the mind. They call the senses the horses. That's quite clear. The senses have been imagined as horses because it's an analogy. The objects, these are the ways, and the discriminating people call that internal self, that entity that sits within, the enjoyer, not all the time, but when it is associated with the body, the senses, and the mind. All right, we covered this already. Then it says, gives a reference in the commentary, it thinks as it were and shakes as it were. This is a cross-reference to the Untitled Upanishad, the 4th chapter, 3rd section, 7th stanza, and is beautifully put. It thinks as it were. It doesn't actually think. shakes, as it were. It seems to move. It seems to be fearful. It seems to be doubtful. But it is not. It's just a wrong identification. The best we can say is, in association with it, it is the witness. And as we said previously, the witness is automatically the enjoyer, enjoying the scene. But of that intellect which, being ever associated with a strained mind, is endowed with discrimination, the senses are controllable, like the good horses of the charioteer. What is practice? Practice is essentially the application of discernment or discrimination in all the things that we do, looking at the mind, steering it correctly. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, it is a sense of detachment that comes as an effect of it. This is what is called practice. This is defined as practice. Then it gives us a hierarchy. And I think I put this on the board the last time. I'm going to do it again. But he, that master of the chariot, does not attain the goal through the intellect, because the intellect is just as instrumental as anything else. It is reflected through the intellect. It seems to be separate. Who, being associated with non-discriminating intellect and an uncontrollable mind, is ever impure, and he attains worldly existence. He does not attain the goal, if that is the case, through this association. And I mentioned last time that this repetition is significant. It means that this is laboring the point. That master of the chariot, however, who is associated with a discriminating intellect, on the other hand, and being endowed with a controlled mind, is ever pure, attains that goal, getting it detached, from which he is not born again. So now a little bit of commentary has to take place here. What constitutes purity of mind? What constitutes purity of mind is a mind that is controlled to the extent that there is no sense of ego within it. Ego meaning egoism, selfishness. That is, no sense of individuality. The closer we get to that, the purity is our mind. It is, in short, engaging in that element that is known as sattva. Now we have to resort to the Sankhya way of looking at things. Everybody agrees on that there are three evolutionary forces going on in everything we see, whether it's physical, psychological, whatever it is. And we can classify this as sattva, rajas, and tamas. Tamas literally really means darkness. It means that we can imagine in the dead of winter, where all anybody wants to do is stay in bed, inertia sets in. What is the classical animal example of this? The bear in hibernation. But the hibernating state, nothing's happening. And so we can view the states of the mind. We can see when it is disinterested, when it is lazy, when it is dull, when it wants just to withdraw. A state of dullness, darkness, inertia. This is called the quality of tamas. Then we find the opposite, extreme energy. I want to be a go-getter. I want to be active, doing this, doing that, doing the other thing. When we look at it properly, who is the beneficiary? It is the so-called ego complex, the body-mind complex that we've just described as a chariot. But a chariot, if you coming back to that wonderful example, has so many different parts. Even one wheel has so many parts, so many different spokes, a hub, an axle is necessary, maybe a bearing is necessary, a rim is necessary, a proper periphery that engages more comfortably, if possible, with the road. In more advanced chariots or carriages, springs are necessary. And then we see that there is a container, a kind of box that fits onto the whole thing. It has to be bolted, it has to be attached in some way that it doesn't fly off. And then the horses themselves have to be harnessed to it, have to be fixed. There has to be a bridle. There have to be reins. The horses themselves have to be there. All of these are constituent parts. And wherever we have constituent parts, the one rule in philosophy is not for the good of itself. It is for the good of another, an independent entity, an enjoyer. So, being endowed with a controlled mind is ever pure, attains the goal, getting detached from which is not born again. We have dullness, we have extreme activity or egocentric orientated activity. We have selflessness. We have all the noble values of humanity, of truth and beauty, goodness and love, and compassion and harmony, of generosity of spirit. The human biological entity, if that is what is thought of, is the only species that has this capacity. Nobody else has this capacity. Nobody has the capacity to take all the difficulties, so-called, and material that we find in our forest of life and transform it usefully into something good, something noble, something pure. And when we see somebody like this, we automatically resonate with it. We don't know why. It just automatically resonates with us. See the admiration that Nelson Mandela is held in. See the great, great esteem that Mahatma Gandhi is held in. People who do things not for name or fame, but anonymously, working for the goodness and welfare of the world without any sense of what will the fruits of it be, what will the effects of it be, how will I benefit? Who cares how you benefit? You don't benefit at all, so be it. This comes into one word, love. I don't care. Love, pure love, will have no reward in it. Any action done from pure love will have no selfish motive. It's not like our normal concept of human love. That master associated and will not be born again, not done because he'll not be born again. And then you see, how can the master be born again is an objection. No, it's only the associated thing, this mistake, this misunderstanding that seems to allow us to feel born again. And here we introduce the English word soul. If we want to use the Sanskrit term, we can use jiva or jivatman. That is, that Atman, that supreme self that is associated with this. Now we can shift our terminology a little. It is also Purusha. Purusha because you have to grasp a certain idea. It's intrinsically pervading everywhere. It has no boundaries. It is Purna, it is free. It derived from that term. It is always there. It doesn't come, it doesn't go. And so this will come up later when we describe the hierarchy of entities. The man, however, who has, this is an answer to the question the commentator puts, what is that goal? The man, however, who has, as his charioteer, a discriminating intellect and who has under control the reins of the mind, attains the end of the road. It's not that the chariot is going haphazardly here and there. There's a certain destiny, an overall destiny. Come on, this is the way. Jesus says, I'm the way. He didn't say, I'm the way, the only way, by the way. He says, I'm the way. The other day, we went up to Dungannon. So it's my experience that when I take some people up there, sometimes, with the lull of the car and so on and so forth, they fall asleep. It means they weren't observing things properly, and they weren't seeing that the road itself is the way. This divine is the road itself. I am the way also. So, what will he attain? He attains the end of the road. And that is the highest place of Vishnu, and the commentary mentions this. of the all-pervading Brahman, that's the meaning of Vishnu, of the Supreme Self, who is also called Vasudeva. That means Vasu, if you look at the footnote, it says, you see, Vasa is a dwelling place. So Vasu is that everything is within that entity, and Deva, that entity, is also effulgent, self-effulgent. The sun is not self-effulgent. It seems to be like that. When you investigate properly, some entity is making the sun shine. And so this is Vasudeva, which is the man of knowledge, what the man of knowledge will attain. Now the commentary goes on usefully. It says, now this portion begins in order to show how the goal, that is Brahman, that is to be reached, is already saying, well, that's the goal, and this is what you need to apply. But what is the method? The method is through an ascending gradation from the gross to the more subtle, to the more subtle, the more subtle, the more within, the more pervasive, the more subtle, going in a kind of hierarchy and ending in this. This hierarchy is that the sense objects are higher than the senses because the senses are there to reveal them, to see what they are, to understand what they are. In that sense, in that context, they are higher than the senses, all right? What is higher than the senses? The mind is higher than the sense objects. But this intellect is higher than the mind. And the great soul is higher than this intellect. That means, what is the way? It doesn't end there. This higher soul, this great entity, this what is called Mahat, is higher than the intellect. But the unmanifest, where nothing moves, where the three evolutionary forces remain in a kind of equilibrium, that is higher than this great one. And then the highest of all, nothing is higher than this, is Purusha. Purusha is higher than this unmanifest. And there is nothing higher than this Purusha. That Purusha is the culmination, the highest goal. So now we have a way, a process. The process is like this. It is to take these gross elements and dissolve them as they were into that which is a little bit more subtle. Dissolve them into the mind. That gets dissolved into the next subtle one, the intellect. That does get dissolved into that Mahat, that great one. That gets dissolved into the unmanifest. That gets dissolved, as it were, into Purusha. This is the very opposite of what we call evolution. How did this all arise? This Purusha, this one pervade, with the potential to pervade anywhere, everywhere, that doesn't move, that thinks as it were, that shakes as it were, that entity that is pure being manifests, as it were, into avyakta, one which has a potentiality in it. That manifests then as a great cosmic mind, a Mahat, expressed as Om, Hiranyagarbha, Nous, Logos, cosmic mind, cosmic Christ, cosmic Buddha, cosmic Ramakrishna, whatever. That manifests itself as all these subtle elements. There are 5 of them, and all senses of individuality collectively called as egos, all egos. Now we have gone through this before, and I'm going to go through them again. It's 11:30, but for the sake of a few moments, I can go through this, something that I repeatedly do. If you understand this, you really, really understood the practical way forward. So we can start off from an evolutionary point of view. So we start off from Purusha. And you can see, I hope you can see that. And this is the process. If the process is evolution, the process of where we come from, how we find ourselves in this position, the process is devolution, going backwards. We have to devolve. We have to do the opposite of evolution, unfolding. So, all right, from Purusha. From Purusha comes the unmanifest. Unmanifest. This is potential. Nothing is moving there. But within this are the three gunas not doing anything. And it is this interaction, the start of activity. What comes out as absolute purity, sattva, it comes out as cosmic mind, what is here called Mahat. It is also mentioned as Hiranyagarbha. Plato calls it Nous. We can call it Logos, the word. That becomes flesh and dwells amongst us. That becomes everything else. And from this creative cosmic mind, our individual intellect comes. This individual intellect can be described as all egos. But now we have what we call space. Space and matter. From there comes what is called Vayu. Now this, don't forget, all the objects and all the sense organs go together, but there's a subtle variety of it. So from here comes, see, all sounds, all ears that catch it in their subtle form. You can consider this as a hardly moving entity. Modern science calls this void. Modern science calls this vacuum. Vacuum energy, sometimes it calls. And then from here, it becomes grosser, less fine, less subtle, less immense. And here we find this comes as movement, energy. From here comes all pressures and all skins that catch it. And from that, it gets more and more agitated. And the result of agitation will be friction, and the result of friction will be heat. And so we find all things that radiate and shine. This comes out as all things that are seen and all eyes that catch it. Things that shine. Radiation. And from this aspect comes a consolidation, a cooling down. That cooling down comes up as all liquidity, liquidity. That is, all things, all tastes, and all mouths that catch it, mouths or tongues. And then we find the solids. That is, all sense, all noses that catch it, all in a subtle form. And then we come to our chariot. So now here we have 5 organs, 5 organs of information, 5 organs of reaction, These are compared to horses. These are the horses. Naturally, the roads have to be objects. So 5 objects. And coordinating all of this is the individual mind. And this whole thing is our chariot and charioteer. All of this is. So you can see that all of this is composed. Now, what does meditation do? It takes all of these, it traces them back in increasing subtlety, back, step by step, like a ladder, until ultimately we come to this. And this is called God, a personal God, a creative God, a Lord, Isha. And that can be traced back to a potentiality, non-manifest. And that can be traced back to the highest principle. And this highest principle is expressing in this way. But when we trace it back, then ultimately in discovering this, only this remains and nothing else is there. And all of this goes away. That is the highest realization. So this process is overall called meditation or spiritual practice. But does it mean sitting down? No. Don't forget the parable is of a chariot and a charioteer. We should be driving it. All our activities should be with these kinds of things in mind. And so we now have a mix. We have 3 things, coming back to the Maitri Upanishad. These 3 things are the knowledge, austerity, if you will, or discipline, the will to change and form a new habit by promoting all the noble, pure values in our life in terms of thinking, feeling, and doing. And then we have also the option of this meditation where we can go in deeply and make the discovery. You can't meditate all the time. And so you can do everything in a meditative way. You can't pray all the time, but you can always be prayerful. So that's the cultivation. We leave it there because now it is beyond our boundary of 11:38. I hope this time suited everybody. And I'm still kind of debating whether we go back to 11 o'clock. 10 o'clock is out of the question, or whether 10:30 is just as suitable. So that's okay. All right. Anyhow, thank you. And we finish off with chanting peace, peace, peace 3 times. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.